It was the beginning of the Second World War, the Bolshevik Revolution leading Joseph Stalin into complete power over the Soviet Union took place nearly 9 years ago. 4 years, anti-Jewish riots took place, also known as pogroms, ravaged the USSR. The inclination of Jewish discrimination led to the first one in Yelisavetgrad, Ukraine, burning churches and quickly spread the violence around the country. The hatred quickly boiled up, leading Stalin to decide to create concentration camps for Jewish people. However, the concentration camps were not ready, leading the Jews' fate in the small Nazio island to wait. Little did the 6,700 Jews brought by the barges know they would never make it to the concentration camp, and 4,500 would never make it off the island.
Today, locals still see the saddening impacts of the Nazino tragedy of 1933. Jewish families each year hang a wreath on the cross graves that consumed the island. The locals alone hold the legacy of those lost that year through generations. Due to Stalin's dictatorship over the press, the only reason the information ever got out of the country was one brave USSR government worker named Vasily Velichko. Born in 1860, Vasily was a poet and a journalist. He worked for the Russian Assembly. After seeing the brutal conditions the prisoners were facing from the guards and from the freezing cold of the island, Vasily Velichko told of what he saw by writing a book. It caused an outrage in Moscow. He soon was fired from his position as a cost for the truth he told. He also attempted to save those left on the island after the inspection. He only found dead bodies lying in stick shelters in the high untamed grass, nor were many of the survivors a pretty sight. German-controlled Russian territories, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine, went through the Holocaust, killing many of the Jews. But little do most know that those territories were not the only ones with cruel persecution of the Jews. It had already been going on for many years. It all started with the creation of Gulag concentration camps by the director Matvei Berman. His idea? To solve the population and oppression issues through a farming system. He believed he could reinstate the international passport system to take everyone who didn't have their passport to be deported to the small surrounding islands to make them productive. This was just a deceitful trick to deport thousands of people to small, harsh islands to harvest goods and make up for the failure of the nation. Even people who did have their passports were deported as well. One of the few survivors tells of how they had a passport, but no one kept it on them at all times, and he was grabbed and forced to abandon his family. The evil only starts there. 1933. Stalin takes as many people without passports as he could from Siberia, fitting roughly 6,700 people onto the boats. His goal was to take them to the concentration camps. However, they had not yet been prepared. Instead, they arrive on Nazino Island, a small island in Siberia, 3 kilometers long and only 500 meters wide. The prisoners and Jews were then unloaded onto the swampy strip of land on May 18th. Many died the first night through starvation, disease, and even the freezing cold temperatures. Some had even died on the ride from the barges from illness and weakness. After the 10th day, the island was too small to feed the large number of people. Prisoners were willing to do whatever it took to survive. A killing system, authorized by the prisoners, began. The people were split into categories: those who had what it took to survive, and those who wouldn't have made it anyway. The less able to survive became the very survival of those willing to do whatever it took. the system was almost completely merciless, except for those who were lucky enough to just have the fat and muscle stripped from their body and devoured, leaving them with enough to survive. A survivor of the tragedy explains how she talked to a woman with her calves cut off. She had explained that they were cut off and grilled, and her body had withered as if in old age, while in reality, she was only in her 40s. It quickly became impossible to not understand what had been happening on that island. Dead bodies were left inside of the stick shelters developed by the prisoners, and the human skin hung from trees like a clothing rack. You may ask yourself, what would you do in this situation? Some of you may say that you would just try to escape, but the island was put on guard by multiple Soviet soldiers. They were not reluctant to shoot anyone that came too close. The guards sat back and watched the horrible events take place on the poverty-stricken, abused people sent to that island. The most food sent to the people consisted of small pieces of bread, almost like teasing them, for it wasn't nearly enough. People went mad for the small piles of flour distributed among them. The guards, no longer wanting to participate in the brutal fighting of the prisoners, then disputed them into brigades, choosing a prisoner to lead each one and distribute the rations. This only led to even more corruption, as the brigade leaders ate all the food themselves. Those lucky enough to be given some of the flour had no utensils to cook the flour. Most ran out of options and tried mixing it with river water. As you could imagine, this only added to the death toll, as many were given dysentery as a result of one of their only ways of survival. This only added to the reason people had gave in to cannibalism. A testimony given by a family that visited the island each year talks about how they saw a woman pushed against a tree and murdered as they cut off any body part and muscle they could. She recounts trying to save the still living woman, but she lost too much blood. The absolute horror of living long enough to see people cutting your limbs off and devouring your body parts is an insanely merciless death. Now, for the families who had to carry on that story, the island will always be known as Death Island. The main question to ask yourself is, what would you have done for your own survival? Would you have taken it that far, or chosen death as your own fate? Mid-June, the horribly failed experiment had finally been ended by Stalin himself. 2,200 were left alive. The fate for most of those survivors was still in the hands of the authoritarian dictator. He did not end the experiment on Nazino Island out of pity, but out of need for their work elsewhere. Stalin shipped the survivors to other work camps. As I mentioned, Stalin was unable to keep the failed experiment a secret. After exposing the truth written from Vasily Velichko's book, the guards were imprisoned. For what they had done, they had only gotten a 12-month sentence in a standard prison. After the dissolution of the USSR, a memorial was placed on the island. It is known for a large cross that reads, "To the victims of political repression." This seemingly peaceful end was only the beginning of a cruel fate for many in the country of Russia. Events followed, such as the famine in Ukraine, killing 7 million Ukrainians, and the Great Purge, killing another million. We'll discuss these events in the next episode of Russia's Deadly History. This is a bonus interview with English teacher Miss Warren of Clinton High School.
Hello.
Have you ever heard of the historical event known as Nazi-No tragedy?
I have not heard of that before.
Do you think our history teachers probably know about it?
Do I think the history teachers know about it? I feel like they should, but as an English teacher, I wouldn't know, I guess, in a sense, all the content that a history teacher would know.
Surprisingly, some of our top history class teachers have never heard of the event. Do you think it's important to pass down history to generations?
I do. I think if we cannot look at history or if we ignore history, sometimes we can't learn from our mistakes, or even we can't learn from our accomplishments either. So I do think it is important for history to be passed down from generation to generation.
Even if the historical event is graphic and violent?
Depending on the age group that can handle that type of topic, I still think it should be passed down. You don't have to always get into the details of it, but I do think it is important to still share what happened, because we can't just shy away from things that make us uncomfortable, because then we wouldn't be able to handle anything, I guess, in a sense.
Thank you.
All right.
And now a word from our sponsors. Is it rough times? Are you not trying to buy an expensive box of Cheez-Its? Enjoy some Savor-Its. We practically stole the recipe from Cheez-Its. So just come on down to your local store and get yourself some generic, good old cheese crackers. We put the savor in Savor-Its. Come get you some cheesy goodness.